I want to talk in this segment about something that we don't ordinarily think about, but is worth thinking about. It's kind of a very interesting philosophical question, which is, do we have free will? Do we have free will? Now, in ancient times, this question was debated, but the denial of free will was typically attributed to God. The ancient Greeks believed that the gods control how we think and what we do. And even in Christianity, there is a strain of Christianity that is predestinarian, that denies free will. This is not necessarily the mainstream of Christian thinking, but it's an influential strain. And the idea here is that God decides for us. In fact, God has decided even the fate of our souls in advance. We don't have free will, and we are not free to choose. God has chosen for us. And in modern times, the denial of free will comes mainly from people who appeal to science. I've done a debate against the atheist Sam Harris. Sam Harris is a podcaster now, but he's also a neuroscientist. And he's the author of a slim book on free will that's just sort of called Free Will. And I want to read the kind of money line from that. He goes, "Free will is an illusion. Our wills are simply not of our own making. Thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exercise no conscious control." Now, the basis for this in neuroscience itself is really quite simple, and that is that our thoughts are not different from our brains. Our brains are physical objects made up of neurons, and those neurons operate according to physical laws. And it's the firing of the neurons that, in a sense, generates what we think of as our mind and our thoughts and our choices. But since the neurons aren't under our control, we no more control them than we control, like, our digestive system, the argument is we can't have free will. Now, I want to refute this in a rather unusual way by appealing to an argument. I think an argument so original and creative and forceful and decisive that it hasn't even quite sunk into many people who know the philosopher who came up with it, the philosopher being, of course, Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was a German thinker of the 18th century. Many people regard Kant as the greatest of the modern philosophers. In fact, perhaps if you were to make a list of the 3 greatest philosophers of all time, you would put in that list Plato, which of course kind of includes Socrates, Aristotle, and Kant. Now, Kant is known for many things. He wrote 3 important books, well, really 4. He's known mainly for his book called The Critique of Pure Reason, a book that some people say you should study philosophy for the sole reason of understanding that one book. It kind of opens a new window on the way you understand the world. But I want to focus here on an argument that Kant makes about free will. An argument that is original not only in its starting point, but also in its direction, and surprising. So Kant basically starts with morality. And Kant says we have in the world morality. Morality is a fact in the world that is no less real and obvious than any other fact in the world. Morality is as real, for example, as a flowing brook or a tree. Now, what do we mean by morality? We mean simply the notion that you ought to do something. Notice that the things we do are divided into sort of 2 categories, the things we do and the things we ought to do. And our life would be virtually inconceivable if it didn't contain the notion of ought. You must do something. Take a simple instruction from a mom to a child. You ought to do your homework, or you must do your homework. Now, says Kant, let's pay careful attention to this. If the mom is saying you ought to do your homework, it necessarily follows that you can do your homework. In other words, if you ought to do your homework, you have to have the ability to choose to do your homework. In other words, ought implies can. It would make no sense to say to someone, you ought to do something if they had no ability to do it. It would make no sense to say to someone, you must do something, if they were like, well, I don't have a choice. My neurons control all my choices. What's the point of telling me to do something? What's the point of telling me to do anything? Because I have not only no choice in this matter, but I have no choice in any matter. So Kant's point is that the very existence of morality in the world shows that we must have choice, because otherwise all moral rules, all moral instruction, all moral exhortation would become completely meaningless. Even if I say to you something as simple as, you ought to throw a ball, that would be a meaningless statement if you had no choice in whether you can throw the ball. Now, of course, Kant accepts the idea of physical and natural laws. Kant accepts the idea that if you choose to throw the ball will follow a trajectory, a parabola that is given, you may say, by the laws of Newton. So science has a place in the world in determining how material objects behave. But our ability to choose to throw the ball, says Kant, and this is the startling implication of what he's saying, not only shows that we have free will, but it shows that there is a part of us that does not inhabit the natural physical world. Think about it. If the physical world is governed by physical laws, and yet if we have choice, not just moral choice, but any choice, if we have free will, then that free will, says Kant, must come to us from outside the world, which is to say, it is, in Kant's own phrase, transcendent. It comes from, you may say, a world other than our own. Now, one can, of course, deny this argument. One can say something like, well, Dinesh, moral rules are all bunkum. Morality makes no sense. There's no such thing as moral propositions. But think about what you're saying. What you're saying, ultimately, is that no one can ask anyone to do anything because they have no ability to choose. I mean, think about Sam Harris's book. Think of what he's doing. Here's my book, Dinesh. It's on free will. Yeah, Sam, well, what are you trying to accomplish with this book? Well, Dinesh, I'm trying to persuade you that there's no free will. Yeah, but Sam, how can you persuade me if I didn't have free will? The whole concept of persuasion implies, this is Kant's point, implies the right to choose. The very effort of publishing a book and trying to build an audience and trying to ultimately make arguments that convince people is based upon the idea you're presuming that they do have the freedom, the choice to go, yeah, that's a good argument. I can go along with that. So our whole, not just our moral life, but our life as humans, if you subtract our moral capacity, what do we become? Well, we basically become psychopaths. We become sociopaths. In the criminal justice system, people are not even held responsible for their actions if they are not believed to be choosing them, if they are not believed to have the capacity or the moral capacity to choose. Bottom line, morality is a fact in the world. We do, in fact, have free will, and even more incredibly, and I think Kant is a genius for showing this on the basis of reason alone. He doesn't appeal to revelation, he doesn't appeal to sacred scripture, but he is saying there is a part of our humanity, namely our ability to think and to choose, that comes from a world other than our own.